The night was unnervingly silent, save for the occasional drip of water from the trees above. I had almost passed by the notice tacked to the lamppost, thinking it another lost pet flyer or one of those cryptic street artist stunts. But the words, scrawled in uneven, deliberate handwriting, seemed to glow faintly under the dim streetlight. Gardner wanted for estate restoration. No experience needed. Ravenshade Cemetery. Apply after sundown. There was no contact number, no name, no further explanation. Just an address I vaguely remembered from the outskirts of town. It was absurd. A cemetery? For gardening? But desperation dulls reason, and unemployment had left me with little choice. I ripped the paper down, its dampness sticking to my hands like it had been waiting for me. By the time I arrived at Ravenshade, the air had turned colder, carrying with it the earthy, cloying scent of decay. The wrought iron gates creaked open as if on cue, their rusted hinges crying out like warnings. Beyond them stretched rows of ancient tombstones, their inscriptions worn smooth by time. A thick fog curled between them, swallowing the path and obscuring anything more than a few feet ahead. Over here. The voice was raspy, like dry leaves scraping against pavement. Turning, I saw him, an elderly man leaning heavily on a cane, his gaunt figure framed by a weathered mausoleum. His eyes, startlingly blue, gleamed with an unnatural intensity. "You're here for the job?" he asked, though it felt less like a question and more like a verdict. I nodded, unable to speak. Without another word, he handed me a spade, old, its wooden handle worn smooth, and gestured toward the cemetery's heart. "You'll find the garden there. Tend to it, carefully." I wanted to ask him what he meant, but before I could, he turned and disappeared into the mist, swallowed as easily as a breath in the wind. The garden was little more than a barren patch of ground surrounded by leaning tombstones. The soil was darker than I had ever seen, black, almost glossy, as though it had been steeped in ink. Kneeling, I pushed the spade into the earth. It slid in too easily, the soil unnervingly soft and pliant. My unease grew as I worked. Every scrape of the spade seemed to echo unnaturally, reverberating through the still air. Then there was the odd sensation of being watched, subtle at first, like the prickling of hairs on the back of my neck. But no matter how often I glanced over my shoulder, the cemetery remained empty, the tombstones silent sentinels in the mist. The first sprout appeared by dawn, shooting up from the soil where I had planted nothing. At first I thought I was imagining things. No flower grows overnight, especially not in soil as cold and unnatural as this. But there it was. A pale, slender stem topped with a bloom that shimmered in a way that defied nature. Its color shifted, deep violet one moment, a brilliant gold the next, as though it were alive in ways flowers shouldn't be. By the time I returned the next evening, more had emerged. They seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light, their petals whispering against one another as the wind stirred them. I didn't want to stay long, but the work demanded precision. The old man had left no instructions beyond, "Tend to it carefully," and I was too unnerved to seek him out again. As I crouched over the flowers, their faint luminescence painted my hands in otherworldly hues. It was then that I first heard it. A faint murmur, just at the edge of perception. "What was that?" I muttered aloud, glancing around. The cemetery was empty. No breeze stirred the fog. No night birds sang from the trees. The whispering grew louder as I leaned closer to the flowers. My breath caught in my throat as I realized the sound wasn't coming from the distance. It was coming from the blooms themselves. That night, I dreamt of a garden, lush and wild, where the flowers screamed, I awoke with the sensation of fingers brushing against my arms, though my room was empty. My first instinct was to quit the job, to leave Ravenshade and its cursed soil behind. But something, curiosity or maybe something darker, drew me back. On the third night, I noticed a pattern. The flowers, arranged seemingly at random, marked graves that had no names or dates. Their headstones were smooth, as though scrubbed clean of identity. Digging near one out of morbid fascination, I unearthed something brittle. A bone. Thin, yellowed with age. It crumbled slightly as I touched it. A cold shiver coursed through me as I brushed away more soil. What I found beneath chilled me to my core. A small wooden box, its surface carved with runes I didn't recognize. As I lifted it, the whispers stopped. But the silence was worse. When I looked up, I swore I saw movement among the tombstones, shadows where there should have been none. Something was watching me. Something that wasn't alive. The wooden box sat on my kitchen table, its carved surface glinting dully in the weak light of my single hanging bulb. I had tried to leave it at the cemetery to forget it, but my hands had betrayed me. It felt heavier now, as though it carried more than its small size should allow. The runes etched into the wood seemed to writhe when I looked at them too long, their jagged lines bending and twisting as though alive. No amount of online searching yielded anything close to their strange alien design. I thought about opening it, but hesitated. A deep, instinctual dread gnawed at me, a warning that echoed louder than any whisper from the garden. By the time the sun set, I couldn't ignore the pull of the cemetery. It was as if the soil itself had reached out, wrapping invisible tendrils around my chest, dragging me back. When I returned to the graveyard, the flowers had multiplied again. Their colors were even more vibrant, their luminescent glow stronger. They swayed as though caught in a breeze, but the air was still. A low hum seemed to emanate from them, vibrating in my chest like a second heartbeat. I crouched near the garden's edge, spade in hand, and dug where the largest cluster bloomed. The soil gave way easily, almost eagerly, crumbling like powder between my fingers. What I found beneath was worse than the bone from before. It was a hand. The flesh had long since rotted, but the skeleton remained intact, curled in an unnatural claw. My breath caught as I noticed deep grooves etched into the bone, marks made by fingernails. Whoever this had been, they had died scratching at something, desperately trying to escape. The whispers returned, louder than ever. They didn't just fill the air. They filled my mind, pressing against my skull until I thought it might split. The flowers trembled as though caught in a gale, and the ground beneath me pulsed. For a moment I swore I felt the earth breathing. Leave it alone. The voice wasn't a whisper this time. It was loud, guttural, and came from everywhere at once. Whirling around, I expected to see the old man, but the cemetery was empty. The shadows between the tombstones seemed to shift and writhe, and for a brief moment I thought I saw shapes within them, long, slender limbs and hollow, glowing eyes. Something was here with me, something unseen but undeniably present. I stumbled backward, my foot catching on an exposed root. As I fell, the spade slipped from my hand and struck the soil. A faint cry echoed from beneath the ground, high-pitched and mournful, sending icy tendrils up my spine. When I picked myself up, the flowers had stopped moving. Their glow had dimmed, and the whispers had faded. But I knew better than to believe it was over. I left the cemetery, the box still in my possession, and ran home without looking back. Sleep did not come easily that night. My dreams were fractured, filled with flashes of skeletal hands, clawing through dark soil, their fingers curling around my throat. Every time I woke, I felt the phantom pressure of those hands, lingering as though they'd been real. When dawn broke, the first thing I noticed was the smell. A sickly sweet odor like decaying flowers, faint but unmistakable. It clung to my clothes, my skin, and even the air in my tiny apartment. I followed it to the wooden box, still sitting on the kitchen table. It had changed. The runes carved into the wood were deeper now, glowing faintly with an unnatural light. My stomach turned as I noticed faint scratches on the lid, as though something inside had tried to claw its way out. I had to know what was inside. Gripping the lid, I hesitated only briefly before prying it open. The moment I did, the room grew colder, and the air seemed to thrum with an invisible energy. Inside the box lay 3 objects: a tarnished silver locket, a small rusted key, and a piece of parchment, brittle and yellowed with age. The parchment bore a single sentence, scrawled in jagged handwriting that seemed to shudder on the page. "Feed them and they will grow. Stop, and they will take you." I slammed the box shut, my hands trembling. The words seemed to echo in my mind, weaving themselves into the whispers from the garden. I didn't want to go back. Every instinct in my body screamed to leave town, to burn the box, to forget I had ever set foot in that cursed cemetery. But that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I found myself walking back toward Ravenshade. The garden had changed again. The flowers were larger now, their stems thicker and gnarled like the veins of an ancient tree. Their glow was almost blinding, casting eerie shadows across the tombstones. The whispers returned as I stepped closer, overlapping voices speaking in languages I didn't understand. Then I saw the old man. He was standing at the garden's edge, but his appearance was different. His figure seemed less solid, his form translucent in the moonlight. When I called out to him, he didn't respond. Instead, he raised a hand, pointing toward the center of the garden. My feet moved without my permission, carrying me to the spot he indicated. The soil there pulsed as though alive, and I knew without a doubt that whatever was buried beneath was waiting for me. Something wanted out, and it wouldn't wait much longer. The soil throbbed beneath my feet, alive with an unnatural energy that made my teeth ache. The old man, if he was ever a man, watched in silence, his form flickering like a dying flame. The whispers grew into a cacophony, the voices overlapping, pleading, demanding, laughing. I couldn't make out the words, but the intent was clear. Dig. My hands, trembling and unwilling, plunged the spade into the ground. The earth gave way easily, crumbling like ash as I unearthed a coffin, its wood blackened and wet. Carved into its surface were the same runes from the box, glowing faintly in the moonlight. I froze, bile rising in my throat as the whisper stopped. For a moment the world held its breath. Then the lid cracked open. A hand shot out, skeletal and impossibly long, its fingers curling like the roots of some ancient tree. The stench of decay hit me, so thick and pungent it brought tears to my eyes. The figure inside, if it could be called that, began to rise. Its form was an amalgamation of bone and shadow, its hollow eyes glowing with a sickly green light. I stumbled back, dropping the spade as the entity emerged fully. Its voice filled the air, low and resonant, speaking words that made the ground shudder beneath me. You have fed us. Now, we bloom. The flowers around us began to writhe, their stems twisting together into grotesque shapes. They grew taller, larger, their petals turning black and glistening like oil. I watched in horror as one of the blooms opened, revealing not a center of pollen but an eye, wet, bloodshot and unblinking. The thing from the coffin stepped toward me, its movements unnaturally fluid, its skeletal face twisted into a mockery of a smile. Its shadow stretched out, longer than it should have been, reaching toward my feet like a grasping hand. I turned and ran, but the cemetery itself seemed to shift around me, the tombstones closing in, the flowers sprouting in my path. Their whispers filled my ears, now a single, unified voice. Stay. Tend us. Feed us. Just as I reached the gates, something grabbed my ankle. A root, impossibly strong, pulling me to the ground. I clawed at the dirt, screaming as the thing loomed over me, its hollow eyes burning into mine. In a final, desperate act, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the key from the box. I drove it into the root, and a piercing shriek erupted from the garden. The flowers wilted instantly, their light snuffed out. The entity reeled, its form flickering violently before collapsing into ash. The whispers stopped. The cemetery was silent. But as I stumbled home, the scent of those flowers clung to me. When I reached my door, I found another bouquet waiting on the step, fresh, luminescent, and alive. They were waiting. They would always be waiting,